So good morning. It's good to be back. And this morning I want to begin by sharing some highlights of this conference and a bit of what happened there and what I presented there. There was a lot that happened and some important connections made, which I'll share about this morning and also next week. So, the title of this relates to what I presented. The conference was the International Conference on Science and God. And this was one of several conferences. It's a whole, what they called World Summit 2020. And it was a series of overlapping conferences. So there were, I think, about 10 different conferences. I participated in two of them. One was this International Conference on Science and God, and the other one was the International Conference on the Unity of the Sciences. And that's been going for 25 years, and I've presented at a couple of those in the past. But then they had one on politics, they had one on economic leadership, they had one for the first ladies of different nations. So it was really quite elaborate conference, and altogether on one day they brought all these conferences together, so all these different conferences that are happening separately, and they all had a day in common, and there were 5,000 people from 170 countries. So it was really quite huge. This gives you a little sense of it. In the main room there. These are just photos I just took on my iPhone, so just kind of giving you a bit of a sense of it. And so what was very interesting about this conference was the number of scientists who are coming forward really trying to integrate science and spirituality. And it was quite inspiring in that regard. And the theme of the conference is very similar to the theme of our Unity Center, one family under God, essentially uniting the human family, uniting science and religion. The whole theme of unity was really essential. And so there were lots of different examples. I don't know if you can see this, but don't worry about it if you don't see the details. I just want to give you a sense of the different kinds of theories that were put forward. This one was essentially integrating the holographic structure of reality, something I talked about a couple weeks ago. And this was a scientist from Russia who was outlining these different levels of reality, from the physical, the etheric, astral, all the way up into the divine levels of consciousness, from the gross material world, the subtle. And what was interesting about this is to see how many scientists are really beginning to think this way and to be kind of integrating spiritual truth with scientific truth. Here's another example. A very interesting physicist from the University of Moscow, Gennady Shipov, who's basically developed also a similar understanding of science that's consistent with the kind of 7 levels of reality that we find across the esoteric traditions. So here we have solids, liquids, gases. This is kind of the normal physical realm. And then moving from there to elementary particles into empty space and all the way up to the absolute nothingness. And he's developed this whole understanding consistent with general relativity theory. So he was presenting these ideas. And then here was a sense of the evolution of science. And so we have classical science, the kind of science of the 1800s, which then around the early 1900s was revolutionized with modern science, essentially relativity theory, quantum mechanics. This all happened with Einstein and all of that revolution that we've all heard about. And then maybe 30, 40 years ago, we had essentially a new era of science that they were calling the new science. And this is when we understood the full implications of quantum mechanics and David Bohm's theory developing in physics, and the work of people like Deepak Chopra carrying the implications of the new science into many different fields. And that was really, in a sense, the beginning of the merging of science and spirituality, beginning to interlink. And now this conference was calling for a whole new science that they're calling God science. Because in traditional science, there has been this implicit assumption of atheism. It's almost built in from the ground floor. And I can say, as a scientist going through the official training, atheism was part of the curriculum, although it was never explicitly stated as such. It was just largely assumed. And what is coming forward now is that it is an assumption. Atheism is a metaphysical assumption. And science does not require that particular metaphysical assumption. Science can be done, the whole enterprise of science can also be done with the assumption of the presence of a divinity. Now, science does not offer proof of God by any means, but it also offers no disproof. There is no proof that God does not exist. That's really important. What that means is that scientific atheism is actually an oxymoron. Because there is no proof for the non-existence of God. Therefore, if you're a true scientist, you have to remain agnostic on the question and simply say, I don't know. And therefore, it's a possibility. So that's important. And so science can exist that is consistent with an understanding of a theistic universe or a divine universe in some way. So this was part of what was brought forward. So I'm just showing you some of the slides from some of the different presentations here. And here's another one, tearing down the wall between science and religion. So even talking this way was really quite exciting. I mean, these are not lightweight people. These are very creative scientists who are really working at that interface between science and religion. And looking at how this might be done. And the idea that religion needs science, science needs religion. And as Einstein famously said, science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. So here's one of the physicists that I met there, a man named Menas Kafatos. Beautiful man. We made a wonderful connection. And he has published... Let's see. Whoops! I got to get my clickers straight here. and this here was his partner, who's a neuroscientist, and they're from University in L.A., California, and he's the co-author with Deepak Chopra of this book, "You Are the Universe," which was a bestseller. So he presented on this book, and we made a very nice connection. And I invited him to present in our conference in Argentina. And so he's probably going to do that. He thinks he will, and we're going to bring him up here at some point. So that was kind of exciting to meet this man. And we made a good connection around physics, because he's a physicist. And you don't meet many physicists who can really talk God, but we did. We had some extensive meals together. He was a student of Muktananda. Some of you probably have heard of Muktananda. So he was kind of, his whole spiritual formation was in that tradition. So, that's not very easy to read. Didn't come out. Can you read that? So I'm going to just summarize a little bit, just some of what I presented. And the title of my presentation was Uniting Natural and Esoteric Sciences, Pathway to Discovering the Deepest Secrets of the Universe. So that was a sort of a very modest title. But fortunately, I could immediately get out of the seeming hubris of that title by referencing the Dalai Lama. Because it was really from the Dalai Lama that I got that title. I heard a beautiful talk that the Dalai Lama gave in 1990 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he basically said, if you want to understand the deepest secrets of the universe, there are 4 steps. First, explore the outer universe. the visible, physical universe. Second, explore the inner universe, the inner cosmos, the invisible realms. Third, explore the relationship between the two. This is really important. The relation between the outer physical objective universe and the inner invisible subjective universe. And then fourth, from these three, one can come to know the deepest secrets of the universe. And this whole exploration is going to be really the essence of what we're going to be doing in our Monday night series, which is coming up soon. We're going to be looking at these three, particularly numbers 3 and 4. Because if you think about it, number 1 is essentially the strong suit of Western science. We have really excelled in exploring the physical universe. And number 2 is, in a sense, the strong suit of, if you will, Eastern science, the Eastern traditions, which have developed these deep traditions of meditation and introspection through Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. And then the third is the relationship between the outer and the inner is really the whole domain of the esoteric sciences, of mysticism and Gnosis and alchemy, and all of these different sciences of the transformative process of consciousness. And how do those relate? So anyway, that's all part of what we will be exploring in depth. And I was giving a kind of summary presentation in this talk that I gave. And so from here, and also drawing on Albert Einstein and God, because Einstein is, as you probably know, was one of the scientists who was open to God in the form of Spinoza in particular, essentially of an understanding of God as the beingness of the universe. And so these are just some of the comments that Einstein spoke to in terms of his relationship to God. This slide actually came from one of the scientists' presentations there, about wanting to know God's mind and how he's worked to find God through the creation. And Einstein used to speak about what he talked about the cosmic religious feeling, which he says every true scientist has something of this cosmic religious feeling, this kind of spiritual impulse, that really motivates. And of course, his famous statement, God does not play dice with the universe, which we will go into in future talks in more detail. So what I did in this talk was to also start with sort of Einstein's revelation. And really what I did was to derive the spiritual correlate of Einstein's famous equation. This is how I began. These slides that I'm going to show you were developed beautifully by Jan. I showed a much cruder version of this long back here, but we now have them nicely developed. So, and this is a way of understanding how science and spirituality are really mirrors of one another. And so beginning with the beginning of the story of creation in Genesis, and really across the scriptures, so we have the very essence or energy of pure Godhead, if you will, before creation. And then we have from the different scriptures these different articulations across the scriptures of the world. So from Genesis, darkness covered the face of the deep, and then the darkness breathes over the lumbering waters. This is from the stanzas of Dizon. And there was darkness in the deep and water without form. That's from the Hermetic corpus. And then also from the Rig Veda, from that arose the primal darkness, from that arose the waters of the oceans. You have across these scriptures this reference to the darkness and the kind of eternal oceans, if you will. Let's see, which clicker? This one, okay. And then, of course, we have in Genesis, and God said, "Let there be light," and God separated the light from the darkness. And so then what happens is we go from this darkness over the waters of the deep to let there be light. And the light comes, And this creates essentially the realms of the heavens, if you will. And one way of thinking about this is that the uncreated light, the eternal light of God, is created, and then that gives rise to the plane of divinity and to the creation of the heavenly realms, which are made of light. And then we have also in Genesis, next line, and then God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." Very interesting statement. Let it separate the waters from the waters. So there's a kind of division in this eternal heavenly realm of the waters from the waters. And so what this then does is that we go from this, let there be light, divinity, spiritual momentum. This was the creation of the heavens. We go from this to this, where there is another manifestation of light. And so you can see on the right here, what happens is, this is essentially from the pure essence of God, the uncreated light, creating the heavens, if you will, and then with that firmament, dividing the waters from the waters, physical light, if you will, coming out of the heavenly realm, down into manifestation, creating the physical universe, the cosmos. And over here on the right, we see the process coming from the pure energy of God, the pure invisible essence or energy of God, divided by light, if you will, coming into the heavenly realm, and then divided by physical light coming into the manifest realm. Some of you may remember this from before. And so what this gives us, if we just write this simple little algebraic equation and rewrite it, we get essentially the famous Einstein equation, E equals mc squared. So what I'm doing here, because the orthodox physicist will immediately object and say you're extrapolating. This refers to energy, this refers to mass, that's the speed of light. That's an equation that only holds in the physical plane, has nothing to do with all this spirituality stuff that you're projecting onto it. But what I would say is, no, that's not true. In fact, this is the physical consequence of a higher spiritual principle. And that higher spiritual principle is that there is a spiritual meaning to this equation that has a verticality, and that this equation, as it's usually understood, only applies on the physical horizontal plane. But in fact, this whole evolution and emanation from the Godhead into creating the heavens, and then from the heavens into creating the manifestation, also follows this same formula, this same flow. Why? Because of what's called the correspondence principle, as above, so below, that to every manifest and every aspect of manifestation, there is a spiritual correlate, and there is a direct spiritual parallel. There is a direct correspondence to everything manifest in the universe, in the physical universe, in the heavenly universe. And in fact, the entire physical universe is created by and hangs from the invisible cosmic universe. And this is the whole understanding that's now emerging with the holographic principle. And we'll say more about that later. But I think it was important to bring this kind of understanding into it. And I got some good feedback on this talk, which was sort of always gratifying. Of course, this is all with scientists here. We're all sort of grappling to try to put this together. And so what this comes down to, here on the left are these different levels that I've just spoken of, from the energy to the essentially divinity to manifestation. And here on the right are essentially the stages of the metaphysical process. So at the very top, we have the place of oneness in God, the very essence of the Godhead. And so in terms of the kind of spiritual correlate of that, that refers really to union, the place of union. And then out of that oneness, out of that pure primordial oneness of God, God self-effuses. God basically says, let there be light. And through that articulation of the Word of God, we have, through a process of revelation, God reveals. God gives the gift of revelation into the first level of creation, which is the heavens, the heavenly realm. And then, from this level, through the operation of divine grace, God further self-affuses. So through this operation of divine grace, then the manifestation is created. And in particular, the earth is created. And in particular, if we follow the divine will, the nature of the creation on earth is ideally, hopefully, we all aspire to realize, the kingdom of God, meaning that this plane of reality will be a reflection and a manifestation of the divine principles that are manifest in heaven. So these are the actual stages of the process of divine creation, from the Godhead down right here into our midst. Now, here they are again. These are these several levels or stages. Now, over here we have the science, if you will, or the philosophy, or the religious philosophy, or spiritual philosophy that describes these different levels. So the state of union with God is mysticism. Mysticism is the practice of realizing our oneness with God. And then from this oneness comes this process of revelation. And this is referred to as Gnosis. Gnosis is the knowledge of the revelation of God. It is a very high spiritual knowledge that comes from the seers who are able to realize and experience this process as the oneness of God comes into the creation of the heavens. And then this gives rise to the plane and the laws of divinity. All of this operates by spiritual law given from God. And on each of these planes, there are certain laws that are operative, and they're higher laws than operate down here. So there's a certain sense of spiritual law coming into divine law, coming into earthly law. And at each of these levels, then there's a certain set of phenomena and a certain set of laws that they're all interacting and obeying. And then we come down to the heavenly planes, and from here, and I'm using this word sacred magic because magic is one of the accursed sciences, as we all know. Magic, alchemy, astrology, the I Ching, all of these things are seen as sort of woo-woo or really sort of flaky and sort of mistrusted. And rightly so for certain reasons. But magic, understood in its highest definition, magic really means the operation of higher laws on lower planes. So, for example, when divine law comes, when heavenly laws come and they intervene on this physical plane, there is a sacred magic to that. Now, we all know that magic can be abused and it can be appropriated and it can be exploited. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But the operation of heavenly law coming right down into this plane has the quality of magic. And that can manifest in many different ways, whether it's spiritual healing or certain kinds of spiritual miracles, or I'll give you an example of my own life in just a moment of how some higher force comes right down into the manifest plane and impacts us very directly. So this is what I would, it's not just I'll give a reference to this in a moment, but this is essentially when the laws of divinity come down and interact right down into the manifestation. Then this is sacred magic or the esoteric sciences. These are the sciences of the invisible and the sciences of the interpenetration between the spiritual and the physical. This is what the Dalai Lama is referring to as that third step, the relationship between the two. And then we come right down onto the physical plane here of the natural sciences. Now, the point I want to make here is that the natural sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, they all operate right at the bottom level here, right at the level of manifestation, right at the level of the natural sciences. And the assumption of atheism assumes that there's nothing more than just this flat bottom to this whole figure. The whole verticality here is all just superstition, myth, and non-existent. That's the orthodox atheist assumption. And what is happening now is at the cutting edge of science and spirituality, this verticality, all of these different stages are being added in to what otherwise is a kind of flatland understanding of reality. And even the new physics, quantum physics and relativity theory, are primarily operative on this physical level alone. And it's only in their interpretations by certain very creative physicists like David Bohm and others that this verticality is beginning to be reclaimed. So we are still at a place where the spirituality of it all is largely denied in mainstream science, and that's why it's so exciting to see this kind of cutting-edge shift that's happening. So now I want to go to, so here again we have these different stages we've been talking about. We have these different dimensions of the process of spiritual involution into creation. We have the different kind of branches of sacred science, if you will, that describe these. And the point here, and then we have the practice. The point I want to make is that mysticism, gnosis, divinity, magic, esoteric sciences, and natural sciences, they are all part of an organic system. And that in our current fragmented worldview, they are understood as separate and distinct. And that runs the risk of essentially breaking up what is all a kind of sacred organism. There is a natural flow and relationship to these. And if they are broken out and if they are separate and practiced as separate disciplines, then they become corrupted, if you will. So, for example, mysticism practiced for its own sake alone can become a kind of spiritual indulgence because it is not brought down into and made relevant in this level, on the physical level, in service. Gnosis, without mysticism, is a kind of sterile enterprise. Magic, without its proper placement in service of divinity, and in this vertical flow, is easily corrupted. It can become sorcery. It can become exploitation. And philosophy properly understood is the understanding of this whole verticality here. Has anyone ever noticed how philosophy can become incredibly abstract and seemingly kind of irrelevant? True philosophy is the understanding of this entire vertical organism and the fact that these all take their place in this whole vertical process, which is sometimes referred to as vertical respiration. So if we look at this vertical respiration for a moment, and I've sort of articulated it here with this process, thy will be done on earth, as sort of symbolizing these different stages. So here is the will of God coming right out of the essence of God as mysticism. And then the first order of divine creation is the command to be. And so thy will be. And when God wills comes into being, we have the creation of divinity, the creation of the heavens. Just from this portion, thy will be, and we have the heavens. And then further, done. So now that being is going to be put into doing. And so we have this done in the manifest plane, done on earth. So there are these stages. Thy will be creates the heavens, done on earth creates the physical universe. And then, of course, when it comes to an individual practitioner like little old me and little old you, thy will be done on earth. Well, what part of the will on earth do you have personal control of? Your own will. You can give your own will to be part of this grand and glorious process of thy will be done on earth. Each one of us I don't have any control over any of your wills. I don't have control over the weather. I don't have control over a whole lot of going on out there, right? But I do have control over my own will. And I do have the choice to place my will in service and make it part of thy will be done on earth by the prayer, thy will be done in me. And so that is my prayer. My prayer is that God's will that be done in me, and that I am a genuine instrument of God's will and God's love. That's St. Francis's prayer, right? Let me be an instrument of thy peace, an instrument of thy love. That's where we actually have the choice to place ourselves in this divine stream of vertical respiration of the divine coming down into manifestation through me and through you. And what is our part then in that? Then we go right back up with our prayer of taking refuge or surrendering God. My will be one with thine. And that is the prayer, right? Let my will be one with God's will. And so you see there's a kind of verticality. Thy will be done in me. My will be one with thine. Or you could say, thy will be done in me. My will be done in thee. And so we have this vertical flow here. We have divine will coming down into manifestation, and we have the individual aspiration of the heart rising up with the intention, with the prayer for my heart's yearning to actually pierce the very heart of God and reconnect me. This is what the Sufis call completing the circle of love. That the aspiration in my heart reaches all the way. I mean, it's an incredible thing when you think about it. We are basically raising ourselves up to oneness with God. That's the intention. It's a very bold and daring stance that we take as mystics. We are saying, I am going to be here as God's representative on earth. I am a walking God, which is what Jesus said. Did I not tell you, ye are gods? He's quoting somewhere in the Torah. But it's very important. We are here to be walking gods, literally. Not arrogantly, but that is our highest destiny. Each one of us is a droplet of living divinity here on the earth. And when we connect to that, we become that. And we hold that prayer deeply in the depths of our being. And this is where natural science, if it's stuck on the physical plane alone, misses all of this. This verticality is what makes it come alive. And thy will be done on earth. Each of these different stages is what mysticism, gnosis, divinity, magic, all of these things come together. And they all have their place within that organic, spiritual, vertical respiration. So I want to give you an example from my own life about this process. It's a bit of an extreme example, but it illustrates the process. As my spiritual teacher says, everyone prays when their life is threatened. Even the most diehard atheist, if they're suddenly facing death, their heart cries out, oh God. I mean, whether they use the word God or not, it's that essence of desperation. Like they're literally about to be annihilated. You cry out. Anybody does. So, as she said, even the atheist prays in moments that are life-threatening. And then she said, but what do the Upanishads say? The Upanishads say very beautifully, we live not by the breath that flows from moment to moment, but by the one who makes the breath flow in and out. We live not by the heart that beats from moment to moment, but by the one who makes the heart beat from moment to moment. We are never guaranteed of the next breath. We are never guaranteed that that next heartbeat's going to come at any moment. It could stop. As the Buddha said, the most certain thing in life is death. The most uncertain thing is when. So in that sense, every moment is life-threatening, which means we should be praying in every moment. like St. Paul said, pray without ceasing. Then at least, you're staying connected, because at any moment God might claim you. So the example that I want to give, and it's sometimes in these extreme moments when the real waking up comes. From my own life, I used to fly small airplanes, little Cessnas and Moonies. And so I flew a Cessna 182. I bought a used 1958 Cessna 182 with two other guys for $15,000. I had to front $5,000, which is a lot of money for them. But $5,000, not bad for a whole airplane, right? So, and I used to fly that all around New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, out to California. And I took it very seriously. I mean, aviation is something you should either do very well or don't do at all, because it's unforgiving of sloppiness. It has a habit of, exacting a very high price for mistakes. And I made a commitment in 1973 when I decided to learn how to fly. I'm going to do this extremely well. And I went out to get the very best flight instructor that I could, the hardest one. And so I was very conscientious. And this was around 1988, I think. At that point, I had a lot of experience. I'd flown a lot. I'd done mostly regular landing strips, but I was getting my chops on bush strips and short strips, dirt strips. And so this one time, I went to really one of the most radical airstrips. I'd never been to it before, but I'd been in similar strips that were short. But this was at the bottom of a canyon in Utah. It's called Mineral Bottom. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but it's at the place where the river trips, they put in for the river trips. And it's at the bottom of a very steep, some of you have been in those Utah canyons with those vertical cliffs, incredibly beautiful, and the river winds around. And to get into this airstrip, you have to enter the canyon and follow the river and descend between the cliffs on both sides, and you follow the river, and then at the last second, it straightens out, and there's the runway, and you got to put it down. If you miss it, you got to go around and climb out the river the same way. So you got to snake your way along with the river. So we landed and we had lunch, and of course I was feeling exhilarated. I mean, the scenery is dramatic. Flying into those canyons with the cliff walls right next to you, it's like, wow, And we had lunch, and then the weather started changing. You're always having to watch the weather. And I'm looking at the weather, and it's like, okay, the wind's coming. And it was, those summer storms can be huge in the afternoon, and they can dump a lot of rain. And I realized we were going to stay the night, but then I realized, if this was a deluge, this whole runway would be mud tomorrow morning. And we might not be able to get out for a few days, because you don't want to take off on a muddy runway and get halfway down and not really able to get in the air. That's not good. I also knew that I didn't have a lot of experience. I'd done this a lot, but I hadn't been in these sandy runways. I didn't want to mess with any moisture on this runway. I wanted it to be like it was when we landed. So I realized the most prudent thing was to leave that day. We wanted to stay the night, but it wasn't worth the risk. But the wind was building, and the clouds were moving in. And so I was with my lady friend at the time, and I said to her, let's get everything ready, let's go. But I'm not going to make the decision whether we're going to leave or not until the last second, because it's going to depend on what the wind is doing right then. And I knew from aviation reading and from my own experience, but also from reading, that wind can do very strange things in canyons, and you can get these Venturi effects, where when strong winds come through, they whisk through those canyons. And so I had some concern about a possible strong wind in the canyon. And I was aware that that was a possibility. But we got everything ready, we got in the plane, and the wind was still, gusting, 8 to 10 knots. It was okay, everything was okay. We got in, we took off. Short runway, 2,000 feet, you don't have much, you got to get up and going. And Then 150 feet in the air, I glanced at the airspeed as we were climbing out, and to my absolute horror, the airspeed indicator was indicating a stall condition. The plane was about to fall out of the sky. And I thought my worst fear had happened, which was because we had good climb speed, but a tailwind strong enough can eat your climb speed, and suddenly you're barely hanging in the air. And I thought the worst has happened, that right as we left, shortly after we left, one of these Venturi winds came in from behind and has basically sabotaged all my airspeed, and I'm barely hanging in the clouds. Now, I mean in the air. Now here we are, which means that stall speed in a plane like that's about 60 miles an hour. So I was going 120 over the ground, but I could have had a 60-mile-an-hour tailwind, and suddenly I'm about to crash. So against every instinct in my body, this is years of flight training, I lowered the nose. I mean, the last thing you want to do when you're 150 feet in the air with the jaws of the river and boulders churning below you is to descend. But I knew that if I tried to climb in that moment, it was certain death, because the plane will stall and go straight in the river. And so I lowered the nose and got as low as I dared. 50 feet off the water, less than a wingspan from the water. And the other thing, of course, is that we were headed straight for a cliff. Normally, they don't build runways where right when you're taking off, there's a cliff right there at the edge. It's not the normal thing, have you noticed? But in this case, there was. And so I had no choice but I had to make a 180-degree turn, because that's what the river did. I had to follow the river. The problem is that when you enter a turn, stall speed goes up, and I was already at the stall speed. But when you enter a turn, you're more likely to stall. And so I was really scared entering that turn. And yet, I had no choice. It's either that or the cliff. So I started scanning for where I would try to put it down if I felt it trying to stall, because if it starts to stall, I have to land. Otherwise, I will stall and go straight into the water head first. Certain death. It was scary. And it was like, but I went into this turn and I made the turn, and normally in an airplane you have some choice about what angle of turn. And at that slow speed, I would have chosen a shallow angle. But in this case, the steepness of the turn was determined by the curve itself and the fact that it was bounded by a cliff all the way around. So I had to follow the river. And so I had to do the steepness required to track the river. And I did. And the plane hung in there. We made a whole 180-degree turn, still 50 feet off the water. And then there was a straightaway for maybe another 3/4 of a mile, and another cliff straight ahead where I had to do another turn. And so we made that turn, and then I sat there and I was shaking, and here we are, and it's still reading stall speed, and I'm like, what is going on? And then I lost my faith. I shrank. I felt my whole being shrink. And I felt my hands starting to shake, because I realized 2 minutes ago, I was sitting perfectly safe on the ground. And because of a decision I made 2 minutes ago, we're now very likely going to die. With my girlfriend next to me, I was going to kill her and me because of this decision that I made 2 minutes ago. One of the things about plane crashes is sometimes you know you're going to crash before it happens, and you can't do anything about it. Not like car crashes. Usually, it's pretty quick. You don't have time to think about your impending doom while still being fine. But in airplanes, it does work that way. And sometimes. And so there I was. And I started looking around. What is going on? I didn't know what to do. And I started to lose my confidence. I felt so bad. I felt so bad for her. And she was amazing, I have to say. She later told me, she realized her only hope was if I didn't lose it. And I started to kind of, I was starting to not panic exactly, but I was scared and I was voicing it. And she realized if she panicked, it was going to make it worse, and then that would make everything worse. So she actually said, it's okay. She was telling me, it's okay. Just do what you need to do. It's okay. She was calming herself and trying to keep me calm. And I prayed. I didn't really call it prayer in those days because I was a Buddhist meditator mostly. I went to Vipassana retreats. But I was in that place that my teacher was talking about. My life was in danger. I knew it. Severe danger. I was contemplating whether to put it down in the water while I had a straightaway. I had a better shot of landing it in the water if I had a straightaway than if I'm in the middle of a curve. But I also knew I was going 130 miles an hour. It was almost certain death to try to land it in that water. And then something happened that I'll never forget. Because I was losing my will to even try. My hands were on those controls, and it's like, because I was feeling this of my own hands, I have gotten us into this situation. And all of a sudden I heard this sound. I don't know how to describe it, but there was this, and it was from above, there was this whoosh sound that came down through the top of my head into my body and right into my hands, and I felt like some energy came in and took hold of that plane. And there came this incredible resolve. So 1 minute earlier, I was like shrinking and losing faith and I can't do this kind of thing. And suddenly this incredible resolve, right down into the controls, fly this thing. It was like there was another presence that was going to took hold of those controls. And the resolve that came was, I will fly this thing 30 feet off the surface of the water for 100 miles if I have to. I'll do everything I can. It was like some kind of incredibly intense resolve and empowerment to keep going, to not give up. And it wasn't me. It came into me. I felt it. I felt it in my hands. I felt it in my body. And I felt it like, stay focused, get a grip, and deal with the situation. You're still 30 feet off the water. You still got a cliff that you're heading straight for. Deal with it. And so I did. And with that energy, I had this sense, and I kept looking around. And then we entered that next turn, and it was a shallower turn, and we came out of that turn. And I was just, it's like, I'll fly this thing until I have a clear place where I can land it on the ground rightly. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I'll fly this on the river. I don't care how long it takes. It was an amazing feeling. It's like, yeah, we can fly at this. It was incredibly dangerous at one level. And at another level, they could go on for 100 miles. I'll just keep flying up the river, And then I was sort of looking around. Of course, I was checking the instruments, checking everything. And then I looked at the wings, the flaps. I thought maybe the flaps had come down on their own. They hadn't. I was looking. And finally, I saw something out there on what's called the pitot tube. It's a little tube that sticks out in the airstream so you can measure the speed. And it was sticking there, and I saw it out on the wing, and it had this little cover on it. It's a little cover that you're supposed to remove before flight. And the design of that cover, I should have written to them and said, this is a bad design. Because the design of that cover was it's two pieces of material sewn together like this, and it was old. The plane was old. It was 30 years old, and it had dried out. And so what was happening is there was enough air getting in between the threads of this pitot tube. I was flying at 130 miles an hour, but there was enough air getting through there to indicate on the speed indicator that I only had 55 or 60. Shaking, which is right at the stall level. So I was getting a stall indication because it was covered. Of course, I immediately realized that was my mistake and that everything was fine and the feeling was that we were surrounded by walls of death. I remember the cliffs became walls of death, and there was a thin blue strip up there of life, which was the blue sky. And at that point, I could just suddenly pull back on the wheel, and we could just climb right into it. And we went and we landed. And when we landed at the airport and we brought the plane to a halt, then I just burst into tears, and kind of just processing all of that. But that was a moment in which my prayer was answered, my desperate need, and I was collapsing. I was literally shrinking because I had created this mess, and I had done it with my own hands. And then something came in and gave me the courage and the power, the psychic power, and even right into my arms to keep me flying. And the last little point, I don't know if I'm running too late. Just one little point, because it's a little spiritual lesson that came with God's grace here. As I said, I was a very conscientious pilot, right? So why hadn't I removed that thing? Well, here's the thing. As a pilot, you do what's called a pre-flight. You always do a pre-flight. Every time you do a pre-flight, which means you have checklists and you go through the airplane and you go and you inspect the outer plane. You remove that thing off of the thing, right? That's part of it. And you do every little part. I had always done that. I'd never not done that. However, when you go for a fuel stop, so if I fly along and I'm going to land somewhere, I'm going to do a fuel stop, and then I take off again, well, you don't do the whole pre-flight then. You just check the oil, because you've been with the plane. You know it's fine. So you check the oil, check the gas, and you go. And so that moment when we decided and the weather was coming, I said, well, we'll just treat this like a fuel stop. We hadn't left the plane side. We were right there. We had lunch right next to the plane. I knew it was fine. The bad weather's coming. We got to get out of here. I'm going to not do the pre-flight. That's not even, I didn't decide not to do the pre-flight. I decided to treat this like a fuel stop because we were right there. And it is like a fuel stop. We just didn't get any fuel. But I checked the oil. I checked the gas. Everything was cool. We got in the plane. We took off. I didn't remove that thing. But here's the best part. When I bought the plane 3 years earlier, it was an older plane, like I said, and those little pitot covers, they have a 4-foot thing, great big letters hanging down that says "remove before flight" that flaps in the wind like this. That had been torn off. And when I bought the plane, I could have bought one of those new covers, but they were, like everything in aviation, priced 10 times what they're worth. So it's like $25 to buy one of those. I thought, well, I would never not do my pre-flight. Not me. I would never ever do that. So I don't need to waste money on getting one that has that whole thing hanging down. I've got a perfectly good cover for the thing. It's fine. And I'll never not do my pre-flight, so I'm fine. So that little introduction of arrogance right then, 3 years later, because of course that whole thing flapping in the wind is only for those times when for some emergency reason you didn't do your pre-flight. And sure enough, had it been there, flapping and all that, I certainly would have seen it and taken it off. But I didn't, and I didn't. And I almost died because of it. But God saved me. So, thank you.